Welcome to CSGuitars, the science of loud. Today you're going to experience an unscripted and rambling video all about cables. The other scripted and more produced videos are taking a bit longer to get together. I've got a few of them on the go at the one time. They're coming together, but for now, let's roll back and talk about cables. I've done a couple of videos about cables in the past. One on the instrument versus speaker cables and the differences between them, and one on balanced versus unbalanced cables and the differences between those. I suggest you go and look at those, very important information, and we might cover some of that again here. But I'm talking about cables again today because I've just received a package in the post from Hosa, who do some very excellent quality cables, and it's what I've been using for a long time in the studio. Now, we're quite used to seeing the bigger, sexier products being shown on this channel. The guitars, the amplifiers, the effects, and all the science and technology that goes into them, and cables often take a bit of a back seat in all of that, despite them being exceptionally important for connecting it all together, for getting signal from one place to the other. They're an important, vital, and critical part of the whole setup, and we really should talk about them more. Especially as the cable industry is full of myths, misconceptions, and snake oil of companies trying to sell you over-exaggerated features for over-exaggerated prices, when really it's not making that much difference at all. So that's why I like to get my stuff from Hosa, despite the fact that I've got to pay an import charge to get the stuff into the country. They've got a range, different tiers of products at different price points, but none of it goes to that exploitative, over-exaggerated threshold that you see in other places. They're just doing high quality stuff at prices that are reasonable for what you would expect for that quality. We'll take this guitar cable, for example. This is from the Hosa Edge line, which is the highest quality cables that they do. And there's three things that I would like to talk about here about these cables, which I want to dispel some myths about. The first thing I want to talk about is the cable itself. This is OFC grade. OFC stands for oxygen-free copper. Inside this black protective jacket, the conductive material which is actually carrying the signal is copper. It's a highly conductive metal which is malleable and can be formed into a whole bunch of different shapes, which is why we see it so often in cables and electrical connections. But to get copper into a form where we can work it and manufacture cables from it, we need to go through certain processes. The raw copper itself is full of impurities which impede electrical conductivity. These different elements within the copper stop the flow of electricity, preventing the copper from being as conductive as it possibly could be. So during the smelting process, oxygen is introduced into the copper to purge the material of all the other impurities, which is great, but it does mean that oxygen is left behind in the copper. Now, that oxygen that's left behind is still going to impede the conductivity of the copper, so you can put the copper through another process to remove the oxygen, or remove as much of it as you can, and that's where we get oxygen-free copper cables from. OFC is actually a bit of a misnomer. The cable's not oxygen-free, there's still a very small amount of oxygen in there, but to be classified as oxygen-free cable, it needs to have less than 0.001% oxygen, which is a very, very tiny amount. There are different grades of copper used for cables, each with a different amounts of oxygen in them, and the conductivity of the copper increases as the oxygen content decreases. So you would think that to get the best sound out of your cable, when using it with an amplifier and a guitar, you'd want the cable with the least amount of oxygen to get the best conductivity. But the thing is, it doesn't actually matter in this context. The grade below oxygen-free copper, or OFC, is called ETP. I forget what that stands for at the minute, but essentially it has about 4 times the amount of oxygen in it than this does. But that only puts it at 0.004%, something like that, something incredibly tiny still. And the conductivity measurements between the two are pretty much comparable. You will absolutely never notice it in the context of using it with a guitar amplifier. In a similar fashion, the grade above OFC has even less oxygen in, so it has better conductivity, but the conductivity increase is probably less than 1%. It's completely negligible and isn't noticeable in an audio application. So you're probably thinking, if the lower grade cable has the exact same conductivity as this, and this is more expensive and it doesn't give you any benefit in conductivity, what's the point in going for the more expensive cable? Well, it's got nothing to do with conductivity. It's all got to do with build quality. Any company who's spending more money on the better quality copper is also going to be spending more money on the physical construction of the cable. You're going to get thicker cable, you're going to get braided shield, you're going to get double shielding, your outer jacket's going to be more robust. Having this cable listed as OFC gives me the reassurance that what's on the inside and what's on the outside will be well made, robust, and will last, because nobody in their right mind would spend more money on the more expensive copper just to make a crap cable out of it. Where the oxygen content content of a cable does matter is in scientific or technological industry applications where the oxygen content of the copper that you're using in the cables can have a devastating impact to a very expensive experiment or production yield of whatever you're manufacturing. Say, for example, you're running a particle accelerator or some other experiment where you've got these cables as part of a high vacuum apparatus. Under strong vacuum, it's completely possible for the oxygen to leach itself out of the copper, and now you've got oxygen atoms floating around in what once was a vacuum, and that could totally mess up any results that you're trying to get. Or if you're working in the semiconductor industry, similar could happen. You've now got oxygen floating around in places you don't want it to be, contaminating your manufacturing. Now, for these reasons, you'd want as little oxygen in the copper as possible, but it's not for electrical conductivity reasons, it's for chemical purity reasons. You're not wanting oxygen as a contaminant in your experiment or your industry. So even in the applications where the oxygen content of the copper does matter, it matters for reasons of contamination, not for reasons of electrical conductivity. So at any point when people are trying to sell you these cables on them being more conductive and therefore better, it's kind of a moot point. Point number 2 I'd like to make about these cables is the connectors. These are nitric or neutric connectors, depending on how you want to pronounce them, and they're exceptionally robust and well made. Now, when cables fail, they typically don't fail somewhere along their length, they typically fail at the connector, either inside where the solder joints meet and something's broken, or they've been flexing too much at the point where the cable meets the connector and you've broken a connection there inside. With good quality connectors, you reduce that risk, mainly because inside of this you've got some plastic strain relief holding it all in place, making sure that you can't get any flex at the solder joints, so those will never break loose. And they're all enclosed inside a high quality rigid metal connector. These are exceptionally high quality and they will prevent a lot of the problems that you'll usually see with cable failures. Also, for reasons of robustness and conductivity, you want to make sure that the connectors are made from good quality metal and they're not just the cheapest crap going. And again, with neutric connectors, you're getting that. So that's another point in the favour of these cables. And point number 3, you've probably already noticed that these have gold-plated jack plugs on them. Now, gold-plated jack plugs are often sold with the concept that they are more conductive. Gold is a highly conductive metal, so you coat it with gold and you get better electrical conductivity. And that is true, but much like the OFC copper, the increase in conductivity is so small it's basically negligible. So the gold plating doesn't really give you any advantage in electrical conductivity or signal transfer. That's not what it's doing, but it does have another advantage. The huge advantage for plating the connections in gold is that gold doesn't corrode or oxidize. That's why it's such a good material to make jewellery out of. Wedding rings and earrings, and you can lose your wedding ring in the garden and dig it up 50 years later and it still looks as shiny as it did when you lost it. Gold is impervious to moisture in the atmosphere, so it won't form an oxidized layer which builds a barrier between this and whatever it wants to connect to. Unplated connectors can and often do, and that's what reduces their conductivity. Think back to when we had games consoles which were cartridge based, your Nintendo Entertainment System or your Sega Mega Drive or whatever. You would sometimes put the cartridge in and it wouldn't work. Now, it was popular to then take it out and blow it because, oh, maybe it's dust. It never was dust. The reason was that the connections had formed an oxidized layer, and it was the simple act of pulling it in and out a few times that scraped the oxidation off and allowed the contacts to meet and be electrically conductive. With gold-plated connectors, you don't have that problem. They will always connect as you go in, and that's really why gold-plated connectors are an absolute win on cables, not because they're more conductive, although they are, but the effect is so minimal, but because they're not ever going to corrode, they're not ever going to oxidize, and you're always going to get a connection when you put them in. Hosa even sent over some of this Deoxit gold protection solution, which is designed to sort of degrease and protect the gold plating to keep it as good as it ever was. And I don't know how much snake oil this stuff is. I don't know if it's really necessary to be used, but it does say that it helps protect the gold plating and keep the electrical connection good. I suppose it's just like using contact cleaner to remove dirt and grime and grease from switches and pots. So there's really no difference here, except that you're just using it on the connections of your cables. So those are the 3 main reasons that I've opted for the best quality cable that Hosa offers. And it's not because I think I'm going to get better conductivity and therefore better tone and better signal transfer by going for the more expensive cable. I don't believe that at all. Even the cheaper cables will get you the same tone and conductivity. That's fine. But what I do believe is that these are much higher quality in their build and construction and their longevity. And I think that's what's most important when it comes to cables. Not the signal transfer per se, because all of them can do that well, but their build quality and their robustness, especially if you're going to be taking these on tour. You're taking them on the road, you're using them night after night, coiling them, uncoiling them, putting them on stages, stepping on them. You want to make sure that the cables that you're using are robust and are going to survive for years. And I'm very much of the opinion that you pay more money and you buy once rather than paying less money and buying several times. I like the idea of having the good quality thing that lasts forever, and that's certainly the experience that I've had with Hosa in the past. It all comes down to how hard wearing and well made something is, and I used to manufacture cables for a job, so I can appreciate a well put together cable, and these Hosa cables certainly are. They're using the good connectors, using the robust abrasive resistant jackets. It's good copper that's on the inside of them. The electrical connections are great. I honestly can't rate these highly enough. I'm going to spend the rest of the day recabling my studio with all these cables that I've got here, labeling them up and making sure I know where each one goes. I want to say thank you to Hosa for continually supporting me. They help what I do here on this channel. Whenever you hear my voice, whenever you hear guitars, whenever you hear anything, the signal has been transferred through their cables at one stage or another. So if you're looking for cables yourself, please go and check them out and consider buying from them. They do a lot to help me, and I would really like you to support them if you can. But anyway, that's all for now. Keep it loud, and I'll see you later.